In this part of our notes, we're going to talk about changes to populations over time. What can affect population size? What can affect population growth rate? First, we're going to take a look at population growth curves, which show a change in population over time. When we look at the beginning of the population, we see that we have this initial growth rate. The slope of the line represents the rate of growth. And since we don't have a steep slope to this line, that means that our initial population growth rate is low. The population is going up, but we don't have a high rate of increase, and it's simply because we have very few individuals at that time. This could be just about 50 individuals in that population. However, once we start to get enough that are able to reproduce, we see that this line increases in steepness. So our population growth rate has increased, and this population is experiencing exponential growth. Exponential growth is that maximum growth rate that we see there. We see a large increase in the population over a short period of time. Birth rate is far exceeding the death rate, so the population is going up. Eventually, though, we see that the slope of the line becomes less steep. In this situation, the population is nearing what we call carrying capacity. This line represents the carrying capacity of that population. And this line represents the maximum number of organisms that can be supported by the environment. Now you can see that our line goes up and it kind of overshoots carrying capacity, and then it goes below and above and so on. Now, this is called fluctuation, and our population normally fluctuates around that carrying capacity. But let's talk why this growth rate is starting to increase, why organisms reach a carrying capacity. Eventually, there's going to be so many of them consuming a lot of resources that there can be a lack of food, nutrients, energy. There's less space. They're more crowded. We see an increase in disease. Now there's a large population that's getting noticed by predators. So there could be more predators than in the area, or the predator population has gone up because there's been an abundance of food for the predators as well. A population is going to fluctuate around carrying capacity when that population overshoots this maximum number of organisms. So let's say that's about 250. 250 of these individuals can live in that environment. When we get above 250, there's too many of them. So there's not going to be enough food and resources and space. So we're going to see death rate is higher than birth rate, and the population is going to fall, and usually falls a little bit below carrying capacity. But in this situation, now we have more resources available because we have less than the carrying capacity. And so we're going to see then birth rate is going to go higher than death rate, and the population is going to go up again. So again, we're going to see this population reach carrying capacity and then level off and fluctuate around carrying capacity. So our stages of population growth, here's that initial growth, which is very slow. Here is our exponential growth. Right here, our population is nearing carrying capacity, and then here we're seeing this fluctuation around carrying capacity. Since we're talking about rate, we're going to take a second to review calculating rate. Rate is the change in something over the change in time. When we see a change in something over a change in time, so time is on the x-axis, then it's pretty easy to ask you to calculate rate. So we're going to calculate the change in something or the change in time, or it's just simply the change in y over the change in x. So if I asked you to calculate the population growth rate during exponential growth, then we would look at a time like this. We would try to calculate the slope of this line. So we could look between 6 minutes, and we can even go up here to about 8 minutes, or hours in this case. At 6 minutes, our population was here. At 8 minutes, our population was here. So let's figure out our values. We're going to call this about 250, 250 individuals. Let's call this about 500. So our change in the population during that time, our change in Y is 250. And during that time, we had 2 hours. So then our calculation would be 250 individuals increased in 2 hours. So we have 125 individuals per hour. That's our population growth rate. Now we're going to look at what we mean about limiting factors. I already mentioned a few limiting factors: the amount of food, the amount of space, predation, disease. Those are considered limiting factors. Now we can categorize limiting factors as either abiotic or biotic limiting factors. On the EOC, they're going to give you scenarios, and they're going to say, in this ecosystem or in this habitat, we see an increase in, and I'll mention a limiting factor. So you have to predict what would happen to the populations in that area. So let's go through some abiotic limiting factors that would increase carrying capacity. Remember, abiotic means non-living or like anti-life. So what would increase the carrying capacity? Allow more organisms to live in that environment. We know that more organisms can live in an environment if there's a higher temperature. So if we increase temperature, then we usually get an increase in carrying capacity. In the springtime and the summertime, there's more plants because of the warmer temperatures. So we can support a larger number of organisms during that time. But the carrying capacity falls in the wintertime here in North America. So an increase in temperature would increase carrying capacity. An increase in rainfall increases carrying capacity, because then we get more biomass produced by the plants. The plants are growing more whenever there's an increase in rainfall, because there's an increase in photosynthesis. Now let's talk about biotic limiting factors. So living things that can affect carrying capacity. If we have a decrease in predators for a period of time, then that would increase the carrying capacity of the prey that they're eating. If we have a decrease in disease, disease is considered living because it's caused by living things like bacteria and fungi. Increase in disease is going to increase carrying capacity. Now let's talk about what would decrease carrying capacity in a population. Again, let's focus on abiotic. A natural disaster. If that destroyed an ecosystem, a habitat, then you would see a decrease in carrying capacity. An increase in pollution, again, leads to habitat destruction. So we're going to see a decrease in carrying capacity. A decrease in carrying capacity if we have a decrease in food or in the plant life. We would see a decrease in carrying capacity if there's an increase in an organism's competition. If there's an increase in competition or competitors, we're going to see a decrease in carrying capacity. So again, everything that's in this column is living. Everything that's in this column is non-living. There are two types of population growth curves. This one can be called a J-shaped growth curve, or the more technical term, it's called an exponential growth curve. We see a population increasing over time. It is increasing exponentially, and it's not hitting a carrying capacity. There's no carrying capacity being reached. So the population keeps increasing and increasing. Now, the only species that has ever shown a lack of a carrying capacity or has not reached a carrying capacity, there's always a carrying capacity, but we just might keep moving that number of organisms up. The only species that has this J-shape or this exponential growth curve so far is the human species. Someday, though, we will start to run out of resources. And then we're going to see more of a population growth curve like this because we will have reached our carrying capacity. This graph that I'm showing you over here is called a logistic. And I want you to add, this is logical. This is what happens for most organisms, most species in an ecosystem. Logically, they're going to hit a carrying capacity. There's only so much food and space and so on. This can also be called an S-shaped growth curve. So again, in this situation, we have a carrying capacity. We have a maximum number of organisms. Let's say it's 10,000 for a certain species. And so we're going to see slow population increase, but eventually we hit exponential growth. And then the population growth rate starts to slow down or lower, and then eventually we reach a carrying capacity. Now, just because an organism or a group of organisms reaches a carrying capacity, it doesn't mean that they're always going to be at that carrying capacity. I'm going to use this graph to show you that if there's a change in some kind of limiting factor, like predation or disease, then our carrying capacity might actually go down to a new carrying capacity for a certain period of time. So we mentioned that there's limiting factors for all populations, and we're going to note some of the most crucial or critical limiting factors for organisms. And that's the fact that human activity is changing the habitat size for species or populations. And the number one cause of extinction and loss of biodiversity is habitat destruction by humans. You have to remember that organisms that are not migratory, when their home is lost, their habitat is destroyed, they cannot just move to a new habitat. A lizard is not going to be able to just move to a new habitat or find a new habitat in the nearby area. There might not be another one. Organisms also are not able to just switch to a new food source. They are highly adapted to catch and eat certain organisms. So if those organisms are removed, they can't just switch to a new food source. During the Great Potato Famine in Europe, there was a lack of food, and even humans tried to do this. Since there was no potatoes, there was no food to eat, people were trying to boil and eat grass. But not even we can do that in this situation because we can't digest grass. We don't have the enzymes to do it. So not all organisms have an abundance of food resources available to them, and they can just switch to a new one if theirs is gone. And one thing I need you to note, we've talked about this before, is that if we have rapid changes in the environment, then that will most likely lead to extinction. However, if there's gradual natural changes to the environment, then that can lead to evolution of a species over time. Formation of adaptations to exploit resources can take tens of thousands of years to evolve. And if the change is gradual, then we see populations adapt to those changes. But again, a rapid or abrupt change is going to lead to population drop. And if population continues to drop, then it could lead to extinction. We've already done a problem like this, or this exact problem. And we talked about something like a flash flood. That is a rapid change. And so sometimes I have students who have a tendency, they want to pick A, that they're going to be able to adapt, but that's evolution, and that takes hundreds, if not thousands of years to occur in a population. So this is our correct answer B. The population of salamanders is simply going to drop in this situation because they're not going to be able to find food. We're going to take a second to look at human activities with a negative influence, and as I mentioned before, habitat destruction is the number one cause of populations going extinct. We've seen examples of introducing exotic species, or sometimes they're called invasive species, or introduced species. And since they do not have a natural predator, then they will outcompete the native species and drive them to extinction. When we have a loss of biodiversity, then that can cause an ecosystem to collapse. pollution by humans also is leading to habitat destruction, which then is causing the extinction of species. We're going to quickly mention a few types of pollution that are in the headlines. One is acid rain. Whenever we drive vehicles, we burn fossil fuels, then we release certain substances in the atmosphere that contain sulfur and nitrogen. And what happens is those react with water and they form rain that is acidic, and it moves into other areas away from the city because the wind moves the clouds. The clouds will move to a new area. The rain falls out and it creates rain that is very acidic. And the acidic water washes into streams, it gets into the soil, and the soil becomes very acidic. What initially happens is the plant life dies, but we know that all food chains and food webs are dependent on plants. All organisms, even plants, have a very limited pH range that they can tolerate. So when we have the destruction of the plant life, then you're going to have a decrease in the herbivores and so on up the food chain. And then we're going to take a look at global warming. We know that the average temperature of the Earth has been increasing significantly since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And during this time, this is whenever we started burning an abundance of fossil fuels. When we burn fossil fuels, the carbon that makes up the molecules in those organic materials gets released up into the atmosphere. So we have a bunch of CO2 now in the atmosphere, and it makes a blanket. And a blanket is a good thing, but when the blanket gets too thick, it becomes a bad thing. What happens is light comes in, it strikes the surface of the Earth, it gets converted into heat, and the heat can radiate out back into space, and some of it does, but when the blanket is too thick, or that CO2 layer is too thick, then it traps too much heat, and we have an increase in global temperatures over time. Now, not all human activities can be negative or destruction. Here's some activities with a positive influence. We can preserve biodiversity through different conservation techniques. Some things that we can do is recycle. So less resources are harvested. There's been reports, articles, stories about people that recycle so much that all their trash that they accumulate in a year that's non-recyclable can fit in the their glove box of their car. So we can recycle, so we have to then mine and acquire less resources from the earth. We can do habitat preservation. So that means that we can section off large areas of ecosystems and preserve them. One of the most critical pieces of this, though, is it has to be a large area. And lots of times we will say that this area of land is protected, and that's a good thing, but if it's not large enough for certain populations, then we're going to see them go extinct. Imagine the amount of land that you have to preserve to save a population of buffalo that are grazing and migratory animals. You can do habitat restoration. After we see that destruction has negatively affected the ecosystem in a certain way, then we can go back in and try to restore that habitat and those organisms that live there. Education. It's important that we learn ways to minimize our impact, and we educate other individuals or other countries besides ours so that they know things like poaching rhinos to cut off their horns to grind up is not going to be able to affect some of the diseases or the afflictions that they have. And we can restrict hunting and the sale of certain animal products and plant products. Now, why is it so important that we maintain biodiversity? It's pretty shocking the amount of resources that we get from living things. We get our food and diverse diets from a multitude of different organisms. So it's important that we preserve those ecosystems so they're providing enough food for our population as well as other populations. Bees. 60% of the bee population is gone. And bees are incredibly important. If it wasn't for bees and other pollinators, then you wouldn't see all of these fruits and vegetables. We would not be able to produce seeds to grow more crops to meet our food demands. So it's important that we find whenever there's a problem, why are the bee populations decreasing, and then we try to do something to come up with a solution. Manufacturing and building materials. Their clothes are probably made from cotton, which comes from a living organism, or wool, rubber for tires, building material. The list goes on and on. And medicines. It's amazing how many different medicines that you have probably taken within your lifetime that have come from living organisms. And we continue to find more and more. So it's critical that we protect ecosystems and we protect organisms, even those that we have not even discovered, because you never know what chemical they can contain, which could lead to something like the cure for AIDS or the cure for cancer.